Welcome to the case of the compromised campaigner, a Sherlock Holmes adventure from the series Holmes and the New Century, the Edwardian Enigmas, playing in the year 1908. It is my great ambition to set down a record of Mr. Sherlock Holmes's endeavours in this new Edwardian century. While Dr. Watson's accounts are admirable, they often miss the sharper, more modern edge of the enigmas we now face. My own notebooks, I trust, will capture the true spirit of Holmes confronting the complex machinery and shifting social currents of our burgeoning age. I shall begin, then, with a most peculiar affair that threatened to derail a great social movement, a matter I have titled, The Case of the Compromised Campaigner. Chapter 1. The November morning had dawned with a particularly grim aspect, draping Baker Street in a shroud of fog so thick it seemed to muffle the very rumble of the city. A persistent chilling rain wept against the window panes, and within our sitting room at 221B, the only cheerful sound was the steady crackle and hiss of the fire in the grate. My companion, Sherlock Holmes, had been in one of his blackest moods for a week, alternating between scraping mournfully at his violin and staring with unnerving intensity at the commonplace objects of our shared lodgings, as if attempting to deduce from them some cosmic truth hidden from the rest of us. He had not spoken a word since breakfast. The spell was broken not by a client, but by the brisk, familiar tread of Armitage of the sentinel upon our stair. The door swung open to admit him, bringing with it a gust of damp air that smelt of wet wool and newsprint. He was a man who lived by the clock and the headline, and his face was alight with the fervour of a fresh scandal. "Holmes, Watson, I trust you have seen the morning edition." "The entire city is in an uproar," Armitage answered. He brandished a copy of the Morning Post as if it were a battle standard. The page is still damp from the street. He slapped it down upon the table between us, the sound a sharp report in the quiet room. "I rarely concern myself with the uproar of the city before my second cup of coffee, Armitage. Pray, enlighten us," Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. Holmes's voice was languid, yet his eyes, sharp and alert, had already seized upon the bold black print of the headline. "Anarchy in Westminster. Suffragette bomb attacks minister's home. An infernal device, Holmes, detonated on the very doorstep of Lord Harrington, the Home Secretary. Caused a frightful mess, blew in the front windows, but by some miracle no one was harmed. The police have been quick on the uptake for once. They have their culprit," responded Armitage. "Good heavens! And they are certain it was the work of the suffrage movement?" remarked Dr. John Watson. "Certainty itself, Doctor. They found this amidst the debris, not 10 feet from the blast," replied Armitage. Armitage declared, his voice ringing with triumph, tapping a specific column in the paper. Holmes leaned forward, his long, thin fingers tracing the paragraph with an almost surgical precision. His expression remained utterly impassive, a mask of clinical curiosity. A silver lapel pin, fashioned in the shape of a Holloway brooch, inscribed with the initials EV, replied Sherlock Holmes. He read the words aloud from the article, his voice a low monotone that betrayed no opinion. "The pin has been positively identified as belonging to Miss Eleanor Vance, the movement's most vocal and notorious firebrand. An arrest is imminent." He looked up from the paper, his grey eyes sharp. "How remarkably convenient," replied Sherlock Holmes. "Convenient? It's damnable. The woman is a menace. My paper is already preparing a leader on the inherent violence of their entire cause. This act will set them back a decade," Armitage replied. "Precisely. Too convenient, Armitage," Sherlock Holmes responded. He rose from his chair, the languor vanishing in an instant, and began to pace before the fire. The latent energy I knew so well now animated his every movement, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. Consider the logic. A political zealot wishing to make a statement of terror plants a bomb. Is it the act of a cunning conspirator to leave behind, in the immediate vicinity of the explosion, a piece of jewelry so distinctive it is tantamount to a signed confession? Sherlock Holmes responded. He stopped and fixed Armitage with a piercing gaze. It is not the mark of a fanatic. It is the mark of a stage manager. The press, yourself included, have been handed a perfect villain and a simple narrative on a silver platter. It is altogether too neat, too polished. An outrage manufactured to serve an agenda, stated Sherlock Holmes. That is a rather cynical view, Holmes. The evidence is the evidence. Armitage said. Is it? Or is it merely a prop, placed with care after the curtain has fallen? Replied Sherlock Holmes. He made a sharp, dismissive wave of his hand, as if brushing away not just the argument, but the very absurdity of it. No, this affair has the scent of misdirection. The true quarry is not the one illuminated by the footlights. Armitage, looking somewhat deflated, soon took his leave, muttering about deadlines. I watched him go, then turned back to my friend, who now stood by the window, staring down into the swirling grey mists of Baker Street. The fire crackled, filling the silence he had left behind. So you believe this Miss Vance is innocent? Responded Dr. John Watson. I believe nothing as of yet, Watson, save for the fact that the simplest explanation is rarely the most truthful, remarked Sherlock Holmes. His voice was a low murmur, his gaze still fixed on the fog-bound street below, as if he could see the threads of the case forming in the swirling grey. When a crime benefits an enemy far more than it does the accused, one must look past the obvious. We have been presented with the first act of a play. Now we must simply wait for the principal actors to make their entrance. The morning papers, their sensational payload delivered, lay discarded upon the settee. Outside, London Symphony played on, the clatter of hooves on wet cobblestones, the cry of a distant vendor. Holmes had said little since Armitage's departure, pacing before the hearth, hands clasped behind his back, his brow furrowed in intense concentration. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows upon his chemical apparatus. This contemplative silence was abruptly shattered by the sharp, insistent peal of our doorbell. A client, Watson. And one in considerable haste, if the force upon our bell is any indication, Sherlock Holmes noted. Before I could reply, Mrs. Hudson's heavy tread sounded upon the stair, followed by a lighter, more determined footfall. A moment later, she showed a lady into our rooms. The visitor was of middle years, dressed in a practical but well-tailored travelling suit, her expression one of profound gravity. She showed no sign of hysteria or panic, rather she carried an air of resolute purpose. Mr. Sherlock Holmes, my name is Beatrice Shaw. I have come on a matter of the gravest importance, on behalf of the Lyceum Club and the cause of women's suffrage. Miss Beatrice Shaw replied. Her voice, though strained, was steady and clear. Holmes gestured to the armchair opposite his own. Pray be seated, Miss Shaw. I take it this concerns the unfortunate arrest of Miss Eleanor Vance. You have been petitioning Parliament this very morning, I see, replied Sherlock Holmes. The visitor started, her eyes darting to her gloved hands. I could see nothing amiss, but Holmes had fixed his gaze upon the lady's reticule. Why, yes, but how could you possibly know that? Responded Miss Beatrice Shaw. A small smudge of printer's ink upon the clasp of your bag, consistent with that used on hastily produced leaflets. Furthermore, a faint crease on the leather suggests it was recently pressed against a stack of papers, the very sort one presents to a minister's aide. A simple deduction. Now, you believe Miss Vance to be innocent, Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. Miss Shaw leaned forward, her earnestness radiating across the room. As she began to speak, the clamour of Baker Street beyond our windows seemed to fall away. Mr. Holmes, I have known Eleanor for a decade. She is passionate, yes. She is a firebrand with her words, certainly. But she is not a terrorist. She understands, better than anyone, that an act of violence is the very thing that would destroy our movement from within. It would prove every slander the papers print about us. This act is not merely a crime against the government. It is a calculated act of sabotage against our cause, responded Miss Beatrice Shaw. She presented her argument with lucid force. speaking not of emotion but of cold political strategy, a language she clearly felt Holmes would understand. "And the pin found at the scene? It is hers, I presume?" Sherlock Holmes responded. "It is. She reported it lost over a week ago after a rally in Trafalgar Square. Anyone could have picked it up. Mr. Holmes, it is too convenient. It is a piece of theatre, designed to incriminate the most visible and powerful voice in our movement. We must have your help. The committee has authorized me to retain your services, whatever the cost," Miss Beatrice Shaw replied. Holmes steepled his fingers, his grey eyes studying our visitor. For a long moment, only the mantel clock ticked in the silence. At last, he gave a curt nod. "Very well, Miss Shaw. Your reasoning aligns with my own initial doubts. I shall take the case," Sherlock Holmes responded. The tension in our client's features dissolved into profound relief. Arrangements settled, she departed with the same brisk efficiency she had shown upon arrival, her footsteps echoing down the 17 stairs. Once the front door clicked shut, Holmes rose and reached for his coat. "The character of the accused is one thing, Watson, and a compelling one at that. But the anatomy of the crime is another entirely. The press and the police have their narrative. It is time we constructed our own, based not on convenient pins but on hard fact. Come, the game is afoot. We shall begin where the bomber did," declared Sherlock Holmes. The November air bit at our faces as the hansom drew to a halt. Before us stood the minister's residence, a grim monument to the morning's violence. A gaping black wound marked the front facade, where the blast had torn through brick and mortar, and the tang of burnt timber hung heavy in the fog. Shards of glass crunched under our boots like frozen leaves as we passed the constable on duty, the sound sharp and brittle in the unnatural quiet of the cordoned-off street. We found Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard standing near the epicentre of the chaos, his chest puffed with an air of profound satisfaction. He was a man who thrived on simplicity, and this case, it seemed, had offered it to him on a silver platter. His voice boomed, scattering a nearby flock of pigeons. "Holmes! Come to see how a proper bit of police work is done. No need for your magnifying glass this time. The case is as good as closed," Inspector Lestrade replied. He gestured towards a small, evidence-marked box held by a uniformed officer. Inside, nestled on a bed of cotton wool, lay a small enamel pin, its green, white, and violet colours, the standard of the suffragettes, standing out vividly against the grey ruin surrounding us. Found not 10 minutes after the blast, sitting atop that pile of rubble as plain as day, belongs to the ringleader, a Miss Eleanor Vance. We have her in custody. "A clear-cut act of political terrorism," said Inspector Lestrade. Holmes took the box and raised it to his eyes, his expression entirely unreadable. He tilted it this way and that, not so much examining the pin as the space around it. A cold wind whistled through the shattered window frames, carrying with it the distant clatter of a tradesman's cart. Remarkably clean, is it not? For an object to have survived such a violent and dirty explosion, and placed so conveniently for discovery, declared Sherlock Holmes. Lestrade merely scoffed, dismissing the observation as trivial. But I saw the familiar glint in my friend's eye, the spark that signalled he was on the scent of a deeper game. Ignoring the inspector entirely, Holmes produced his lens and a small tin from his coat pocket. He knelt upon the grimy pavement, his attention drawn not to the large, obvious pieces of debris, but to the fine, almost invisible layer of dust coating the stones near the blast crater. His long, nimble fingers carefully scraped a sample of the residue into his tin. He moved slowly, methodically, his focus absolute. To any onlooker he must have appeared a madman, collecting common street dirt whilst the key to the entire affair lay in a box not 5 feet away. I, however, knew better. It was in these microscopic worlds that Holmes often found the grandest truths. "What is it you are looking for, Holmes?" Dr. John Watson commented. He replied without looking up, his voice a low murmur. "An explosion, Watson, has its own unique signature, a fingerprint of soot and chemical residue. The bomb maker tells a story in the dirt. I am merely learning to read it. The pin is a statement, intended for the press, and for men like Lestrade. This dust, however, this is a confession, stated Sherlock Holmes. He snapped the tin shut with a decisive click that seemed to echo in the desolate street. Rising to his feet, he brushed the grime from his trousers, and fixed his gaze not on the ruined house, but on the grey horizon of the city. The constabulary has its evidence, and its prisoner. A narrative has been crafted with altogether too much care. Come, Watson. It is time we met this supposed bomber. I wish to hear the story from the lioness herself, not from the hunters who have caged her. The journey to the police holding cells was a descent into the colder, damper bowels of the station house, the very air seeming to thicken with the scent of carbolic soap and wet stone. Our footsteps echoed unnervingly in the long, gaslit corridor, each sound amplified by the oppressive silence. A final iron-bound door, scraping loudly against the floor, was unlocked by a stoic constable, and we were ushered into the presence of the most notorious woman in England. The cell was small, stark, and furnished with nothing more than a wooden cot and a single stool. Upon this stool sat Miss Eleanor Vance. I had expected to find a woman distraught, perhaps weeping, but the figure before us was utterly still, composed, her back ramrod straight. Her dark hair was slightly dishevelled, yet her gaze was direct and sharp, holding an intelligence that seemed to scorn her miserable surroundings. A low, rhythmic dripping from some unseen pipe provided the only sound. My companion offered a slight bow, his voice calm and even. Miss Vance, I am Sherlock Holmes. I am here not as an agent of the police, but at the behest of those who believe in your innocence, replied Sherlock Holmes. She did not rise. Her eyes narrowed, assessing Holmes with a fierce scrutiny. They told me a detective was coming. They did not tell me it was the detective. And what do you believe, Mr. Holmes? Miss Eleanor Vance replied, I believe in evidence. The pin found at the scene is evidence of a sort, but it is loud, clumsy evidence. I am more interested in the quiet, subtle sort, observed Sherlock Holmes. A faint, humourless smile, more a tightening of the lips than an expression of mirth, touched her lips. She gestured to the bare walls around her. Then you have come to the wrong place. There is nothing subtle here. I am accused of a bombing. On the night in question, I was addressing a meeting of the East London Federation of Suffragettes in a church hall in Whitechapel. There were over 60 witnesses. I did not leave until well after 11 o'clock, Miss Eleanor Vance said. An alibi, then, remarked Dr. John Watson. Miss Vance's gaze flickered to me, dismissive, before returning to my friend. An alibi is a matter for the police to disregard at their convenience. My true defence is one of logic, Mr. Holmes, which I trust you appreciate. For 5 years we have fought to be heard, to be seen as rational participants in the civic life of this nation. We have been ridiculed, assaulted, and imprisoned. But we have always argued from a position of moral and intellectual superiority. Tell me, what conceivable advantage is there in suddenly adopting the crude tactics of the anarchist? To plant a bomb that injures no one, but which serves as the perfect justification for our every opponent to condemn us as violent hysterics. It is not merely a crime, it is an act of strategic suicide, answered Miss Eleanor Vance. Holmes stood perfectly still, his head cocked to one side. His only movement was the slight, rhythmic tapping of his finger against his chin. From somewhere deeper in the labyrinthine building, the distant clang of a cell door being shut echoed down the corridor. You argue your case as you would from a podium. You appeal not to emotion, but to reason. It is a most compelling performance, declared Sherlock Holmes. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the damp air. This is not a performance. It is the truth. Someone has planted that bomb to destroy my name, and with it, the reputation of our entire movement. said Miss Eleanor Vance. Holmes nodded slowly, his eyes alight with a familiar gleam. He had found the thread. He took a step back towards the door, his inquiry seemingly at an end. "You have given me a great deal to consider, Miss Vance. You suggest this is an attack not only on a minister, but on an idea. To understand the attacker, I must first understand the idea they sought to corrupt. Watson, our next stop is the Lyceum Club. We must learn of the lioness by studying her pride," explained Sherlock Holmes. Our interview with the formidable Miss Vance had affirmed my friend's suspicions, and we left the grim confines of the police station for the rather more civilized atmosphere of the Lyceum Club. It was an establishment for ladies of an artistic or literary bent, and in recent years had become a veritable headquarters for the suffrage movement. The air within was thick not with cigar smoke but with a palpable tension. The usual gentle clatter of teacups and the rustle of newspapers seemed amplified in the quiet, a nervous energy humming beneath the surface of polite society. "To the window, Watson. We shall position ourselves there. We are not here to interrogate, but to absorb. A movement's true character is revealed not in its proclamations, but in its whispers," Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. We took a small table, and from this vantage point, Holmes surveyed the room, his keen grey eyes missing nothing. Nearby, 3 young women were engaged in a low, urgent discussion, their faces earnest, their hands gesturing to punctuate their hushed points. "Patience has won us nothing. The papers brand us criminals while we petition like schoolchildren," young suffragette 1 answered. "And what would violence win us, Mary?" "A hangman's noose. Eleanor is right. We must hold the moral high ground. It is our only unimpeachable weapon," remarked young suffragette 2. "The high ground is a lonely place when your leader is in a jail cell," remarked young suffragette 3. The final retort, a fierce whisper, carried clearly across to us. I noted the friction, the clear disagreement on strategy, yet it was the argument of frustrated allies, not of bitter rivals. Holmes's gaze shifted to an older group, whose conversation was more measured, their tones laced with a weary resolve, as they discussed legal avenues and letters to sympathetic members of Parliament. "It is a calculated attack. To discredit not just Miss Vance but every woman who has ever dared to ask for her own vote," answered older suffragette 1. "Precisely. No one who knows Eleanor could for a moment believe this barbarism is her work. Her principles are ironclad. This is the act of an enemy, a coward hiding behind a woman's reputation," remarked older suffragette 2. Holmes leaned back in his chair, a thin smile playing upon his lips. He had heard enough. He took a sip of his tea, placing the cup back in its saucer, with a soft click that seemed to finalize his thoughts. "You hear it, Watson. The discord is one of method, not of motive. They are soldiers arguing over the plan of attack, but their loyalty to the flag and to their general is absolute. A schism of this nature does not breed a traitor capable of such a crude and self-defeating act," Sherlock Holmes said. "So you entirely dismiss the police theory that a more radical faction sought to frame her and seize control?" Dr. John Watson inquired. "Utterly. This was not an act of internal dissent. This was an attack from without, designed to look as if it came from within. The architect of this crime understands the power of public perception far better than they understand the composition of explosives," remarked Sherlock Holmes. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping softly on the polished floor. His period of quiet observation was clearly at an end, replaced now by a familiar, predatory energy. His eyes shone with the thrill of the chase. "Our work here is concluded. We have established the social landscape. Now, we must turn to the physical. Inspector Gregson was good enough to provide me with a small box of dust and splinters from the blast site. I have a peculiar feeling it has a more definitive story to tell than any of these good ladies, and it awaits my full attention at Baker Street," deduced Sherlock Holmes. We had returned from the Lyceum Club to find our Baker Street rooms much as we had left them, save for one significant alteration. The familiar scent of shag tobacco had been thoroughly overpowered by the sharp, acrid tang of chemical reagents. Holmes had commandeered our central table, transforming it into a chaotic landscape of beakers, retorts, and glass slides. The fire in the hearth crackled and spat, casting long, dancing shadows that made my friend, hunched over his microscope, seem a veritable alchemist in search of gold. For an hour I had watched him in silence, my mind still occupied with Miss Vance's colleagues' passionate denials. They were convinced of her innocence, as were we, yet the physical evidence, the pin found amidst the rubble, remained an unassailable fact. Holmes worked with a furious, silent intensity, scraping microscopic particles of dust from a police evidence bag into a watch glass. At last he straightened up, his back cracking audibly in the quiet room. "The game, as they say, is afoot, Watson. Pass me the ether. We must first separate the organic chaff from the inorganic wheat," Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. His voice was tight with a barely suppressed excitement. I handed him the bottle. With a pipette he went to work, his long, nimble fingers moving with a surgeon's precision. A soft hiss filled the air as the solvent made contact, a sound punctuated by the distant, mournful call of a foghorn from the Thames. Transferring a droplet of the solution to a slide, he then leaned back over his brass microscope. Curious. The explosive was cordite. Of that there is no doubt. But it is the stabilizing agent that interests me. The newspapers scream of anarchy, but this is the work of a technician, not a zealot, remarked Sherlock Holmes. Abandoning the microscope, he moved to his array of test tubes, decanting the remainder of his solution into a clean vial. He added another clear fluid, the mixture clouded with a faint, violet hue, which quickly dissipated. Holmes gave a slight shake of his head, a sound of faint disappointment. Not a simple phenol, then. The bomber was more sophisticated. He used a compound that would leave the faintest of signatures, one that Scotland Yard, with their rudimentary methods, would surely overlook. "Now, Watson, observe closely," remarked Sherlock Holmes. He held the vial up to the gaslight, then carefully introduced a single drop of sulfuric acid from the end of a glass rod. For a breathless moment, nothing occurred. Then, as if by magic, a sublime transformation began. A deep, emerald-green precipitate bloomed within the liquid, swirling like a miniature storm, before beginning its slow drift to the bottom. A sharp, triumphant intake of breath from Holmes was the only sound in the room. There we have it." "Is it not a thing of beauty?" remarked Sherlock Holmes. "It is a remarkable colour, Holmes, I grant you that. But what is its meaning?" wondered Dr. John Watson. He turned from the table, his grey eyes blazing with an intellectual fire that banished all trace of fatigue from his features, holding the test tube aloft like a trophy. "Its meaning, my dear Watson, is everything. That green precipitate is the unmistakable signature of diphenylamine. It is a modern stabilizer for smokeless powders, preventing decomposition. But this is no common formulation. This particular variant is a proprietary mixture, its use restricted to munitions of the highest military grade," stated Sherlock Holmes. He set the vial down upon the mantelpiece, with a sharp, decisive click that echoed the finality of his discovery. The scope of our investigation had, in that single instant, narrowed from the broad political arena to a very specific point. It is produced and used in only one establishment in the whole of the British Empire. Our bomber is not a suffragette with a grievance, Watson. Our bomber has access to the Royal Arsenal at Woolwich," observed Sherlock Holmes. The acrid tang of chemicals still hung in the air of our sitting room, a sharp counterpoint to the familiar scent of shag tobacco. Holmes had pushed aside his glass retorts and test tubes, and the frantic energy of the experimenter had been replaced by the still, intense focus of the hunter, who has just caught the scent of his prey. He stood before the fireplace, his tall, gaunt figure silhouetted against the flickering flames, his expression one of grim satisfaction. Armitage, who had watched the final stages of the analysis with a sort of bewildered reverence, shifted his weight from one foot to the other. The heavy silence, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire and the distant mournful cry of a foghorn from the river, seemed to unnerve him. Finally, Holmes turned, his grey eyes shining with a steely light. "You see the board, Armitage, but you do not yet perceive the checkmate in 3 moves," Sherlock Holmes responded. "I see that you have proven the explosive to be of military origin, Mr. Holmes. It is a significant step, I grant you, but it widens the field of inquiry to every soldier in Her Majesty's service, does it not?" replied Armitage. A thin smile touched my friend's lips. He picked up a small vial containing a few dark grains, the residue of his successful test. "On the contrary, it narrows it to a pinpoint. Had this been common cordite, you would be correct, but this is not common cordite. The stabilizer I have isolated, the diphenylamine, is of a purity and formulation used for one purpose only: the experimental proofing of new ordnance at the Royal Arsenal in Woolwich," Sherlock Holmes said. He set the vial down with a delicate click that seemed to echo in the room. His voice dropped, sharp and incisive, each word a carefully placed stone in the foundation of his logic. "This is not a substance a common soldier could procure from the quartermaster. It is not found in a standard-issue rifle cartridge or an artillery shell. It is kept under lock and key, accessible only to a select few. We are not looking for a mere soldier, Armitage. We are looking for an officer, an engineer, or an ordnance specialist. A man who has, or recently has had, privileged access to the very heart of the British military's development workshops." "Good heavens! Then Miss Vance," Armitage answered, "is precisely what I have always maintained she is: a convenient scapegoat. Our true culprit is a man of military bearing and technical knowledge, who harbours a deep and personal grievance against our minister. He has used the political fervour of the suffragettes as a cloak for his own vendetta," explained Sherlock Holmes. Holmes moved to his writing desk and, without another word, began to scribble a message upon a slip of paper. The scratching of his pen was the only sound for a full minute. He folded the note, then strode to the door and handed it to a waiting page-boy he had summoned with a sharp tug of the bell-pull. "Scotland Yard may trawl through service records for a decade. I shall employ a more direct method. I have just dispatched my irregulars, my eyes and ears in the city's underbelly." Sherlock Holmes noted. He returned to the hearth, his gaze fixed on the flames once more. "Their instructions are simple. They are to haunt the service clubs of Pall Mall and the taverns frequented by retired non-commissioned officers. They are to listen for whispers of bitterness. A career ruined, a reputation unjustly tarnished, a public disgrace laid at the feet of our minister. When we find a man who fits both our technical profile and possesses such a potent motive, we shall have our bomber," Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. Armitage stared at Holmes, profound comprehension slowly illuminating his features. He rose to his feet, his bearing suddenly infused with a renewed sense of purpose. "Mr. Holmes, you have given us more than a clue. You have given us a path. I must return to the Lyceum Club at once. The ladies must know that there is concrete hope for Miss Vance," responded Armitage. "Indeed, public perception is the second battlefield in this case. See to your forces, Mr. Armitage. We shall see to ours," deduced Sherlock Holmes. With a final, determined nod, Armitage collected his hat and coat. I saw him out, the heavy front door closing with a solid thud against the encroaching fog. When I returned, Holmes was still by the hearth, his gaze fixed on the flames. "And now, Watson, the most difficult part of any investigation begins. The waiting. But not for long, I suspect. The echoes of a man's disgrace are often louder than any explosion," replied Sherlock Holmes. The thread of the unique explosive pulled us away from the clamour of political rallies and into the hushed, almost sacred confines of Pall Mall. The Senior Sappers Club stood as an edifice of dark stone and tradition, a bastion for men of a certain military bearing. As we passed through its heavy oak doors, the air itself seemed to thicken, growing rich with the aromas of old leather, beeswax, and the heavy, sweet scent of Havana cigars. From the cavernous common room, a low murmur ebbed and flowed, a sound punctuated by the sudden sharp rustle of a newspaper page or the delicate clink of glass against a decanter. Portraits of decorated generals, their expressions stern and unforgiving, stared down from the panelled walls. It was a world entirely removed from the passionate zeal of Miss Vance and her cause. "Here, Watson, we are not hunting a political firebrand, we are seeking the ghost of a career," explained Sherlock Holmes. His voice was a low whisper, nearly swallowed by the room's ambient drone. Armitage, looking somewhat out of his element in his civilian attire, secured us a quiet alcove, from which we could observe without being conspicuous. From this vantage point, fragments of conversation rose and fell on the smoky air, painting a picture of profound discontent. "Disgraceful. The man has no sense of loyalty to the men who served him. Selling the empire out from under us, piece by piece," answered Stout Club member. The speaker was a stout man, with a fiercely waxed moustache, his words a grumbled testament to some unseen political slight. Another, gaunter man, rustled his newspaper loudly in agreement. "He's all for pandering to these shrieking women and radicals. Forgets who built this nation." "Forgets the sacrifices made," Gaunt Club member replied. Holmes listened intently, his eyes closed as if cataloguing every bitter inflection. He made a slight gesture to Armitage, who rose and, with the quiet confidence of his station, approached a white-haired gentleman seated by the fire. Their conversation was too low for me to discern, but after a few moments Armitage returned, his expression grim. "I believe I may have a name for you, Mr. Holmes. A man whose ruin was laid squarely at the feet of our minister. He was a constant presence here until about a year ago." "Major Alistair Finch," Armitage answered. The name hung in the smoky air. Holmes opened his eyes, a flicker of intense light within them. "Finch? Tell me of him." Deduced Sherlock Holmes. "He was court-martialed after a disastrous engagement during the Boer War. The official line was a tactical blunder on his part, but the word in these halls has always been that he was made a scapegoat. The minister, then at the War Office, signed off on the inquiry himself. Finch lost everything: his commission, his reputation. He became, I am told, a man consumed by a singular, burning grievance." Armitage answered. Holmes steepled his fingers, a slow smile touching his lips. I watched, fascinated, as the disparate threads of the case began to weave themselves into a coherent pattern before my very eyes. And there we have it, a military explosive requiring specialist knowledge, a target with the power to disgrace a career soldier, and a suspect whose entire existence has been poisoned by a personal vendetta. The pin was not merely a clue, Watson, it was a masterstroke of misdirection. An attempt to pit two of the Major's perceived enemies, the minister and the suffragettes, against one another. Observed Sherlock Holmes. He rose, a sudden energy surging back into his frame. The lethargy of our earlier efforts had evaporated, replaced by the familiar electric thrill of the chase. "Our work here is done for the evening, Armitage, my thanks. Watson, tomorrow we shall trade this club for the archives of the Times. We must learn everything there is to know about the public fall of Major Alistair Finch," Sherlock Holmes said. The newspaper archive was a tomb of forgotten days, a vast, silent chamber where the only sound was the dry rustle of turning pages, like the whispering of ghosts. A fine grey dust hung in the air, catching in the weak shafts of light that pierced the high, grimy windows, and the scent of decaying paper was thick and cloying. Holmes, however, seemed to thrive in this environment. He moved with a predatory swiftness, his long fingers darting across the bindings of enormous leather-bound volumes. "Here we are, Armitage. The Second Boer War, a conflict that created as many broken men as it did heroes. Let us see which category our Major Finch falls into," Sherlock Holmes pointed out. His voice was a sharp, incisive sound in the oppressive quiet. Armitage, the journalist, stood beside him, his expression one of professional interest tinged with a solemn gravity. He ran a hand over the dusty cover of a volume of the Times. I covered the dispatches from the front. It was a brutal, messy business, Holmes. The public wanted victories, not excuses. Men were ruined for less than a single tactical error, responded Mr. Armitage. Precisely. And our minister, then a rising star at the War Office, was known for his singular talent in directing blame away from himself. Ah, replied Sherlock Holmes. He stopped abruptly, his finger tracing a line in a column of dense print. With a sudden tensing of his shoulders, he wrestled the heavy volume from the shelf, its weight evident in the slight strain of his movement, and laid it open on the table, a small cloud of dust erupting into the air. He read for a moment, his brow furrowed in concentration. Listen to this. Court-martial of Major Alistair Finch. The proceedings concluded today, finding the Major guilty of gross dereliction of duty in the matter of the Spionkop Ordnance Depot. The catastrophic loss of munitions has been laid squarely at his feet, observed Sherlock Holmes. Armitage leaned closer, his voice dropping to a thoughtful murmur. Spionkop. I remember it well. A disaster. The minister gave a rousing speech in the Commons a week later, assuring the nation that the officer responsible had been dealt with most severely. Finch was the scapegoat, sacrificed to save a political career, responded Mr. Armitage. He was indeed. But it is the nature of the charge that is of paramount importance. Loss of munitions, Armitage. Do you appreciate the significance? The report specifies cases of dynamite and artillery shells. Our disgraced Major is not merely a man with a grievance. He is a man with a profound and practical knowledge of high explosives, stated Sherlock Holmes. The disparate threads of evidence, once scattered, now wove themselves into a coherent tapestry within my mind. The motive, born of a ruined career. The means, derived from the very source of his disgrace. We had our man. Later that evening, back in the familiar comfort of our rooms at 221B Baker Street, the mood was entirely different. The fire crackled in the hearth, a cheerful sound that stood in stark contrast to the grim silence of the archive. Holmes paced before it, a tiger in his cage, his mind clearly racing, piecing together the final, elusive fragments of the puzzle. The chain is complete. Finch blames the minister for his ruin, and the suffrage movement for the political climate that allowed it. In one explosive act he sought to discredit both. He plants a bomb, then frames the most visible suffragette, Miss Vance, with that ridiculously convenient pin. The press does the rest of his work for him, Sherlock Holmes noted. It is a compelling theory, Holmes. But a theory is all it is. We have no proof that links him directly to this specific crime, Mr. Armitage replied. Holmes stopped his pacing and turned, a sharp, predatory glint in his eyes that I knew so well. A faint smile played upon his lips. Then we shall have to manufacture it. Major Finch used the press to wage his war. It is only fitting we use the very same weapon to draw him out. Armitage, my dear fellow, you are a man of words and influence. I have a column I should like you to write, replied Sherlock Holmes. The revelation of Major Finch's identity had settled over our Baker Street rooms like a shroud. The hours of poring over dusty archives had yielded a name, a motive, and a means. Yet as Holmes stood before the fireplace, his expression was not one of triumph, but of intense concentration, as if he were a chess master contemplating the final, critical moves of a perilous game. He broke the silence abruptly, his voice cutting through the low crackle of the flames. Armitage, your profession is to be our weapon. We have our man, but we lack the thread to bind him. We must compel him to provide it himself, stated Sherlock Holmes. The journalist, who had been staring grimly into his cold tea, looked up. The weariness in his eyes was plain to see. You wish me to print something? Holmes, my editor is already straining at the leash. Public opinion is a tidal wave against Miss Vance. To suggest anything to the contrary, said Armitage. I do not wish you to suggest her innocence. I wish you to suggest an entirely new line of inquiry. We shall not defend, my dear fellow. We shall attack from a different quarter. We shall print a fiction. A carefully constructed falsehood, designed to prey upon the singular weakness of our culprit. His pride, Sherlock Holmes said. A flicker of comprehension, then grim resolve, crossed Armitage's face. He gave a curt nod. There was no more to be said at Baker Street. The battleground now lay in the press. An hour later, the quiet contemplation of Baker Street gave way to the chaotic heart of Fleet Street. The very air in Armitage's office was thick with the metallic tang of ink and the low, ceaseless rumble of the printing presses in the building's underbelly, a sound that vibrated up through the floorboards like a mechanical heartbeat. Papers were stacked in precarious towers on every surface, and the gas lamps cast long, dancing shadows. Armitage sat at his desk, a pen clutched in his hand, a blank sheet before him. Holmes paced behind him, a caged tiger, dictating the terms of the trap. "Begin with the official police statement," he instructed, his tone precise. "Acknowledge the evidence found at the scene. Then, you must introduce the new element. Write this. Sources close to the investigation now suggest that the explosive device may have been constructed by a second party, a man with military experience, whose assistance was procured by the primary conspirator." Armitage's pen scratched across the paper, but he paused, his brow furrowed in thought. "A second party? But we know he acted alone. What is the purpose of this fabrication?" Armitage answered. "The purpose, my dear Armitage, is everything. Major Finch believes he has executed a flawless plan, a masterpiece of vengeance that discredits two enemies for the price of one. The notion that the police believe he required an accomplice, that his own expertise is being overlooked and credited to another, will be an intolerable insult to his vanity. He will be consumed by the fear that this phantom partner might be identified, a partner who could lead the authorities directly to him." Sherlock Holmes responded. "I saw the genius of it then. It was a psychological assault, aimed not at the man's conscience but at his ego. This fear," Holmes continued, his voice dropping to a low, intense pitch, "will drive him to eliminate any other physical evidence he may have retained. The bomb-making materials, any tools, he will believe them to be his only remaining vulnerability. He will move to destroy them, and when he does, we shall be waiting," Sherlock Holmes responded. Armitage finished the short article, his scribbling the only sound for a moment against the building's deep thrum. He read it over once, then again, a slow nod indicating his understanding, before rising to hand the slip of paper to a young runner. The boy vanished into the clattering hallway, carrying our carefully crafted bait. A profound quiet settled in the small office. The column of ink was now a baited line, cast into the murky waters of London. All we could do was wait to see if our fish would rise. The hours following the publication of Armitage's article crawled by with painful slowness. A thick November fog had descended upon London, pressing its grey, spectral face against our window panes and muffling the familiar clatter of Baker Street to a distant, ghostly murmur. Within our sitting room, the only sounds were the hiss of the gas lamp and the crackle of the fire. Holmes had said nothing for the better part of an hour, his long, thin frame coiled in his armchair, eyes closed. Yet, from the tense set of his jaw, I knew he was not asleep, but in a state of the most acute concentration, listening for a footstep that might signal the success or failure of his intricate stratagem. At last it came, not the heavy tread of a constable, but a sharp, insistent rap upon the street door below, followed by the sound of Mrs. Hudson's latch, and then a patter of light, urgent feet upon the stair. The door swung open to admit a wiry scrap of a lad, his face smudged with grime, but his eyes bright with intelligence. It was Wiggins, the most trusted of Holmes's irregulars. He did not open his eyes, but a thin smile touched his lips. "You have news, Wiggins. Pray, deliver it," Sherlock Holmes pointed out. The boy stood straight, pulling off his cap with a gesture of respect. His voice was a low rasp, accustomed to the quiet alleys of the city. "Got him, Mr. Olmers. Just like you said. Read the paper this morning, he did. and spent the day pacing his rooms like a caged tiger. We 'ad eyes on 'im all the while. Then, 'bout an hour past midnight, out he comes, answered Wiggins, irregular. Holmes opened his eyes now, their grey depths glinting in the firelight. He leaned forward, his focus absolute upon the boy's report. Carried a heavy canvas sack, sir. Looked proper jumpy, he did, glancin' over his shoulder at every gas lamp. Took a cab down towards the embankment. We followed, quiet-like. He got out near Blackfriars, where the wharves are dark and deserted this time. Oh, night. And then? Wondered Dr. John Watson. I could not help myself. The suspense was too great. Wiggins turned his bright eyes upon me for a moment before addressing Holmes again. He went to the edge of a pier, Mr. Holmes. Made sure no one was about. Then he swung that sack and let it go. There was a great splash, loud in the quiet, and then nothing but the dark water. After that he walked off sharpish, back towards his clubland. We saw him go. Wiggins, irregular, said. Holmes settled back into his chair, a deep satisfaction smoothing the sharp lines of his face. He drew a sovereign from his waistcoat pocket and tossed it to the boy, who caught it with a flick of the wrist. Excellent work, Wiggins. You and your division have performed admirably. That will be all, explained Sherlock Holmes. With a nod, the boy vanished as quickly as he had appeared, his footsteps a fading echo on the stairs. I turned to my friend, my mind racing. So that's our proof, Holmes. The bomb-making materials, the tools, all of it now at the bottom of the Thames, Dr. John Watson replied. It is more than proof of possession, Watson, it is proof of a guilty mind. An innocent man, reading that the police suspect an amateur, has no cause for alarm, observed Sherlock Holmes. He paused, steepling his fingers, his eyes fixed on some distant point in his own logic. But a guilty man, our Major Finch, knows his rooms contain the very evidence that would hang him. The article forced his hand. His panicked flight to the river is as good as a confession, deduced Sherlock Holmes. He rose from his chair with a decisive energy that banished the room's weary stillness. He reached for his frock coat and hat, his expression one of grim purpose. And now that he believes himself safe, we shall pay him a visit. Come, Watson, the game is afoot. We have an appointment to keep, and a major to corner. Sherlock Holmes pointed out. Our hansom cab delivered us onto the grand sweep of Pall Mall, where the air hung thick with the scent of damp London stone and horse. Before us stood the Corinthian columns of the Senior United Service Club, a bastion of military tradition and quiet privilege. You are certain he is in there, Holmes? It seems an act of supreme arrogance to hide in plain sight, commented Dr. John Watson. Arrogance is the Major's defining characteristic, Watson. It is what led him to commit the crime, and it is what will lead to his unmasking. Come, explained Sherlock Holmes. A liveried porter admitted us without question, for Holmes's name carried weight even in such august company. We passed through a hall of portraits, the stern, whiskered faces of decorated officers following our progress. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant, rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock and the soft tread of our own feet upon the Turkish carpet. In a far corner of the smoking room, wreathed in a cloud of blue cigar smoke, sat Major Alistair Finch. Major Finch, a man of some 50 years, presented a florid complexion and a bristling moustache that vibrated with indignation. He held the Times before him like a shield, yet his eyes darted nervously over the top of the page. Holmes approached the man's leather armchair, his movements as silent and deliberate as a hunting cat. Major Finch, I believe? I have come to discuss the particular properties of military-grade cordite when used in an urban setting. The newspaper crumpled in the Major's hands. His head snapped up, his face a mask of belligerent confusion. A nearby decanter rattled as he set his glass down with a trembling hand. I have not the faintest idea what you are talking about, sir. "Who are you to accost a gentleman in his own club?" remarked Major Alistair Finch. "My name is Sherlock Holmes. And you know precisely what I am talking about. You know of the careful packing of the explosive, a soldier's work, not an amateur's. You know of the fuse, cut to a precise length to allow for a clean escape. And you know of the pin, a woman's hat pin, placed so artfully amidst the debris as to be unmissable," stated Sherlock Holmes. With each point, Holmes advanced, causing the Major to shrink in his chair. The man's bluster deflated, replaced by a venomous glare. It was a masterstroke of misdirection. "You sought to ruin two enemies with a single stone. The minister who made you a scapegoat after the disaster at Spionkop, and the suffragettes, whose modern ideas you hold in such contempt. You would discredit them all, a twisted act of what you might call honour," Sherlock Holmes noted. "They ruined me, the politician with his cowardice, and those shrieking women who erode the very fabric of this nation. They are a disease, both of them." "I did what any patriot would do," responded Major Alistair Finch. His confession, raw and unrestrained, echoed in the sudden, shocked silence of the club. At that exact moment, as if summoned by the outburst, the main doors opened. Inspector Lestrade stood framed in the doorway, two uniformed constables at his side. "Inspector, I believe you will find your man has something to say. He has been most forthcoming," Sherlock Holmes pointed out, all fight drained from Finch. His shoulders slumped, the bellowing rage replaced by the wheezing breath of a defeated man. As the constables moved forward, the sharp, metallic click of handcuffs being secured was the only sound. A career built on martial pride had ended not with a bang, but with a sordid, pathetic whimper in a Pall Mall smoking room. The case was, to all intents, closed. And somewhere, in a cold cell, an innocent woman would soon be told she was free. The papers, which only days before had condemned Miss Eleanor Vance with shrieking headlines, now offered meek retractions, relegated to the smallest possible type. The arrest and confession of Major Alistair Finch had sent a shockwave through the press, and the name of Sherlock Holmes was once again spoken with a mixture of awe and trepidation. He himself, however, seemed entirely unmoved by the affair, having already immersed himself in a particularly noxious chemical experiment, which filled our modest sitting-room with a scent I can only describe as villainous. The public mind, Watson, is a pendulum. It swings from baseless accusation to fawning praise, with no logical resting point in between. It is a singularly unreliable instrument, observed Sherlock Holmes. He spoke without looking up from his bubbling retort. Just then, a sharp, confident rap sounded upon our door, quite distinct from the tentative knock of a prospective client. A moment later, Mrs. Hudson showed in the very subject of our discussion, Miss Vance herself. She was dressed plainly, but with dignity, her face pale, but her eyes burning with a fierce intelligence. "Mr. Holmes, I have not come merely to offer my gratitude, though you have it. I have come to ask if you now understand," Miss Eleanor Vance replied. Holmes placed his test tube in its rack and turned, arching an eyebrow. The scent of acrid chemicals mingled with the faint smell of rain from her coat. "I understand that Major Finch is a man consumed by a misplaced sense of honour, and that he sought to discredit two enemies with a single cowardly act." "The facts were quite clear," declared Sherlock Holmes. "But do you understand the cause he sought to defame? You see our struggle as a matter of passion, of feminine hysterics. But it is a matter of pure logic, Mr. Holmes, a subject I believe you hold in some esteem," responded Miss Eleanor Vance. Her voice was steady and clear, without a trace of the tremor one might expect from a woman so recently freed from the shadow of the gallows. Holmes gestured to the chair opposite him. "Pray, enlighten me. Logic is the one lens through which I view the world," explained Sherlock Holmes. "The proposition is simple. The law holds a woman accountable for her crimes, yet denies her a voice in the making of those laws. It taxes her property, yet denies her representation in the government that spends those taxes. Where is the logic in that? It is a flawed equation, a conclusion drawn from a false premise, answered Miss Eleanor Vance. "And your methods? The breaking of windows, the disruption of civic order. Do you count these as logical steps?" Sherlock Holmes said. He asked the question calmly, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, his gaze analytical. When all rational discourse is ignored, when petitions are burned and peaceful assemblies are broken up by force, the logical recourse is to escalate, Miss Eleanor Vance answered. She leaned forward slightly, her intensity a palpable force in the quiet room. She was not pleading, but rather laying out the final moves of a chess problem. If a man will not listen to your words, you must make a noise he cannot ignore. It is not an act of passion, Mr. Holmes, but a calculated response to an illogical and intractable system. "It is the only move left on the board," Miss Eleanor Vance said. For a long moment the room was silent, save for the soft hiss of the gaslight and the crackle of the fire in the grate. I watched my friend, and for the first time in this affair, I saw not a hint of condescension in his expression, but rather a look of profound and thoughtful consideration. Miss Vance rose, her point having been made. "I thank you again for my freedom, sir. I hope I have also given you something to consider," answered Miss Eleanor Vance. With a nod to me and a final, direct look at Holmes, she departed. The heavy front door clicked shut, its sound echoing up the stairwell. Holmes remained motionless for some time, staring into the flames. I expected him to dismiss her argument with some cynical remark, but he did not. "Her methods, Watson, are anathema to me. They are chaotic, emotional, and designed to provoke rather than to solve. They are the antithesis of my own approach," observed Sherlock Holmes. "A compelling argument nonetheless." Dr. John Watson replied. He paused, picking up his violin from its case but not raising it to his chin. His voice, when he spoke again, was low and reflective. "Compelling, yes. One cannot fault the cold, hard logic of her cause. An injustice remains an injustice, however shrill the voice that proclaims it." Deduced Sherlock Holmes. The November gales had returned to London, and for 3 days a ceaseless rain had lashed against our windows at Baker Street. The sound had become a familiar companion, a steady drumming that underscored the welcome quiet which had settled upon us since the conclusion of the Vance affair. The newspapers, which had once screamed of suffragette terrorism, were now filled with the sordid details of Major Finch's court-martial and disgrace. With the case resolved and Miss Vance's name fully cleared, an air of profound peace had descended upon our quarters. The hearth burned brightly, its flames casting dancing shadows upon Holmes's sharp aquiline features as he stared into the embers, his long fingers steepled before him. A satisfactory conclusion, all things considered. "It is a rare thing for justice to be so swift and so complete," Dr. John Watson said. Holmes did not look at me, though a thin smile touched his lips. The quiet hiss of the gas lamp filled the momentary silence, a soft counterpoint to the storm outside. "Complete, Watson? Perhaps, but satisfactory. I should call it profoundly melancholy. We have witnessed a man so consumed by a personal grievance that he was willing to ignite a national outrage to see it avenged," declared Sherlock Holmes. He shifted in his chair, the old wicker groaning in protest beneath him. He picked up the poker and jabbed at a log, sending a shower of golden sparks dancing up the chimney. "Consider the Major's position. A career in ruins, his honour stripped away by a politician's expediency. He saw in the suffrage movement not a cause but a caricature, a force of public disruption he could harness for his own ends. By planting Miss Vance's pin, he sought to destroy 2 enemies with a single cowardly act, the minister who had wronged him, and the social progress he so bitterly resented." Sherlock Holmes responded. "He very nearly succeeded," responded Dr. John Watson, I observed, a shiver running down my spine at the thought. The evidence was damning. His voice, sharp and precise as a surgeon's scalpel, cut through my simple assessment. "Too damning, Watson. That was his first and fatal error. An assassin does not leave a calling card. A true fanatic does not so conveniently provide the authorities with the very symbol of their movement. The pin was not evidence. It was theatre. It was a piece of stagecraft designed to direct the eye. And it told me at once that we were not dealing with a political zealot but with a manipulator. Declared Sherlock Holmes. My mind went back to our interview with Miss Vance at the Lyceum Club. I recalled not just her fierce intelligence, but the quiet dignity with which she faced ruin. She possessed an unshakable logic that stood in stark contrast to the chaotic, emotional caricature Major Finch had so desperately tried to paint. In that moment, I felt a pang of shame for any flicker of doubt I might have initially harbored, and his military background gave him the knowledge to construct the device without harming anyone. He wanted a scandal, not a massacre, Dr. John Watson inquired. Precisely. He required a loud report and a great deal of smoke to draw the world's attention to his little play. In the end, it was a simple case of a personal vendetta, masquerading as political extremism. Yet it speaks to a peculiar vulnerability in our modern age, does it not? Public opinion is a mighty beast, Watson, and it can be led by the nose with the most transparent of tricks, replied Sherlock Holmes. He fell silent again, his gaze lost once more in the flickering heart of the fire. The wind howled in the flue, a mournful, almost human sound that seemed to carry all the anxieties of the era. He had unravelled the plot, exposed the villain, and saved an innocent woman. For any other man, it would be a moment of pure triumph. For Holmes, however, the victory seemed to bring only a profound and weary contemplation. Miss Vance and her followers fight with logic, however disruptive their methods. Major Finch fought with deceit, born of wounded pride. One seeks to build a new world, the other merely to burn down the old. It is the clash of these two forces, my dear fellow, that defines our time. A true Edwardian enigma. Observed Sherlock Holmes. With that, he reached for his violin, and soon the melancholy, searching notes of his own composition filled the room, a fitting requiem for a case that had revealed as much about the passions of our age as it had about the specifics of the crime itself. Outside, the rain finally began to subside, leaving only the sound of dripping eaves and the distant, lonely clatter of a hansom cab making its way through the sleeping city.